Mall manager screams at Democrat man in Harris Walz hat, not knowing he owns the entire mall. The hum of shoppers filled the bright, polished halls of Crestgate Mall, echoing with the faint laughter of kids and the low rumble of conversations. It was the weekend, and the mall was alive with families, groups of teens, and bargain hunters weaving through clothing racks and electronics displays. In the middle of it all, standing near the escalators, was Daniel Morris. Dressed in a sleek black blazer, crisp slacks, and an American flag-themed Harris Walz hat perched confidently on his head, Daniel's presence was otherwise unremarkable to the average passerby. He wasn't flashy or loud, didn't call attention to himself. But today, his hat did the talking. It didn't take long for curious glances to turn into lingering stares. Shoppers in passing paused to glance back at him, their expressions ranging from amused to suspicious. An older man wrinkled his nose as he shuffled past, shaking his head. A group of young women giggled nervously, whispering to one another before hurrying into a nearby boutique. Daniel noticed it all but ignored them. He checked his watch, adjusting the brim of his hat with calm, deliberate movements, as though he were in no rush. Nearby, however, the mall manager, Greg Harrison, was watching the scene unfold with growing irritation. From the glass-railed second floor, Greg spotted Daniel immediately, his face twisting into a deep frown. Tall, broad-shouldered, and perpetually red-faced, Greg wasn't exactly known for subtlety. To him, the hat Daniel wore wasn't just clothing. It was a provocation, a direct challenge to what Greg believed to be common decency. "This is the problem with people today," Greg muttered under his breath, his tone clipped. "They think they can wear whatever they want and flaunt it in my mall." Beside him, a young employee nervously cleared his throat. Sir, I don't think he's doing anything wrong. He's just standing there." Greg shot the young man a look that silenced him immediately. "That hat is going to stir up trouble. It's disrespectful, and I'm not about to let someone like him ruin this mall's reputation. You watch. It's only a matter of time before someone complains." The employee hesitated but said nothing, watching Greg storm off with his chest puffed out, headed straight for Daniel. Down on the first floor, Daniel spotted Greg the moment he came into view, striding purposefully across the gleaming tile floor. Greg's expression was one of pure disdain. His fists curled as though he was bracing himself for battle. Daniel tilted his head slightly, a flicker of amusement crossing his face, but he didn't move. Within seconds, Greg was in front of him, his shoes squeaking slightly as he came to a halt. "Sir," Greg began, his voice laced with forced politeness, "I need to speak with you." Daniel looked up slowly, his expression cool. "About what?" Greg's eyes darted up to the Harris Walz logo on Daniel's hat before settling back on his face. "About that," Greg said, gesturing sharply toward the hat. "I'm afraid I can't have you standing here causing a scene." Daniel blinked, genuinely confused. "Causing a scene? I'm just standing here." Greg's nostrils flared. "You know exactly what you're doing," he snapped. "Wearing something like that in a public space is completely inappropriate. You're upsetting my customers." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Your customers? I didn't realize hats were banned here." "It's not the hat. It's the message," Greg fired back, his voice rising slightly. "This is a family-friendly establishment, and I can't allow people to walk around stirring up trouble with political garbage like that. You need to leave." Daniel's expression didn't change, but a slight tension appeared in his jaw. "You're asking me to leave because of my hat?" "Yes," Greg snapped, folding his arms across his chest. "You're free to come back when you're dressed appropriately. Until then, I suggest you move along." By now, people were starting to notice the exchange. Shoppers slowed their steps, stealing curious glances as they walked past. A group of teenagers lingered near a bench, one of them pulling out a phone to record the interaction. Greg didn't seem to care, or perhaps he didn't notice. "I'm not breaking any rules," Daniel said firmly, standing his ground. "I have every right to be here." Greg let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Every right? You don't have a right to offend people. And that's exactly what you're doing right now. I'm not going to ask you again. Leave or I'll have security escort you out." Daniel exhaled slowly, a slight smile tugging at his lips, though his eyes remained hard. You really think you're doing the right thing here? Absolutely, Greg shot back. It's my job to keep this mall safe and respectable. I'm not about to let people like you waltz in here and make everyone uncomfortable. People like me? Daniel echoed, his voice calm but pointed. What exactly does that mean? Greg flushed slightly but didn't back down. You know exactly what it means, he said tightly. Wearing that hat. It's provocative and I won't allow it. You need to leave. Now. Daniel fell silent for a moment, his gaze unwavering as he stared Greg down. Around them, the crowd was growing. Whispers filled the air, and more phones appeared, their screens gleaming as people started recording the confrontation. Greg noticed the attention now, and instead of backing down, it seemed to fuel him. Are you deaf? Greg barked, his voice louder now. I said leave. Daniel didn't move. I'm not going anywhere, he replied evenly. Greg took a step forward, his face inches from Daniel's. Then I'll make you. The crowd gasped collectively, the tension so thick it felt like the air had been sucked from the room. Shoppers froze in place, their attention locked on the two men in the center of the mall. For a split second, no one moved, and then Greg reached for the radio clipped to his belt, his movements stiff and jerky. Security, we have a problem here, he said into the receiver, his voice tight with irritation. I need you at the escalators. Now. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, his calm demeanor holding steady even as Greg's anger boiled over. The crowd murmured louder, anticipation building as they waited to see what would happen next. Daniel adjusted his hat slightly, his movements deliberate. You might want to think this through, he said quietly. Greg sneered, his teeth gritted. I've thought about it plenty. From the edge of the crowd, a teenage boy whispered to his friend, his phone held up to record. Dude, this is crazy. That guy's gonna regret it. The crowd had thickened now, forming an unintentional barrier around Greg and Daniel. Some stood silent, their faces tense as they watched the standoff unfold. Others whispered to one another, their voices hushed but brimming with excitement. Phones remained raised, recording everything. It wasn't every day you saw the mall manager yelling at a customer in the middle of the busiest shopping day of the week. Greg didn't care about the crowd. If anything, it fed his ego. He relished the way everyone's eyes were on him, convinced he was playing the role of the hero. In his mind, he was defending the mall's dignity, protecting its good reputation from a man who dared wear a hat he found offensive. Security's on the way, Greg barked, his voice carrying through the space. You can stand there all you want, but you won't be here much longer. Daniel didn't move. His calm demeanor was a stark contrast to Greg's puffed-up outrage. You really think you're helping anyone right now? Daniel asked evenly, his voice firm but controlled. Greg jabbed a finger at him. Don't act like you're the victim here. You came into my mall with that ridiculous hat, knowing full well it'd cause trouble. If you want to make a political statement, go do it somewhere else. It's just a hat, Daniel replied. You're the one who's making a scene, not me. Greg's face turned redder, his nostrils flaring. Don't play innocent. People like you, people like me, Daniel repeated, cutting Greg off mid-sentence. His voice stayed calm, but there was a clear edge to it now. You keep saying that. What does it mean exactly? Greg stumbled for a moment, as though he hadn't expected to be questioned. It means people who come here to push their nonsense on everyone else. People who have no respect for decent families and decent businesses. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, and someone scoffed audibly. Oh, please, a woman near the back muttered. Daniel tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. So you're saying I don't belong here because of a hat? Greg's lip curled, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Don't twist my words. I'm saying that your hat is offensive, and it's my job to keep this place respectable. If you had any decency, you'd leave on your own. Daniel didn't respond right away. He simply stared Greg down, his silence louder than any words he could have spoken. Around them, the tension thickened. Shoppers shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing that things were spiraling out of control. Even the security guards Greg had called were hesitating at the edges of the crowd, unsure of whether to intervene. "Sir," one of the guards finally said, stepping closer to Greg. "Maybe we should." Greg turned on him instantly, cutting him off with a sharp glare. "Stay out of this," he barked. "I'll handle it." The guard froze, clearly unwilling to push back against Greg's authority. But the hesitation in his eyes was obvious. Even he could see that Greg was out of line. Greg turned back to Daniel, his voice dropping into a low growl. "Last chance. Leave now, or I'll have you physically removed." Daniel exhaled slowly, shaking his head slightly. "You really don't know what you're doing, do you?" That single sentence hit Greg like a slap. His face twisted with fury, and his voice rose again, loud enough to echo off the glass storefronts. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm kicking out a troublemaker who thinks he can waltz in here and—" "Troublemaker," Daniel interrupted, his voice sharper now. "You don't even know me. You don't know anything about me." Greg scoffed. "I know enough. I know you're here to cause problems and upset my customers. And as long as I'm in charge, that won't happen." From the crowd, someone muttered, "This guy's lost it." Another voice chimed in, louder this time. "He's just wearing a hat. Who cares?" Greg's head whipped toward the crowd, his fury now directed at the bystanders. "Stay out of it," he snapped, his voice shrill. "If you don't like it, you can leave too." The crowd fell momentarily silent, shocked by the outburst. The security guards exchanged uneasy glances, their posture stiff as they shifted awkwardly on their feet. It was clear they were beginning to regret being pulled into this at all. Daniel took a step forward, his voice clear and unwavering. "You're embarrassing yourself," he said simply. "You don't need to do this." Greg laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and ugly. "Don't tell me what I need to do. I'm doing my job. Something people like you wouldn't understand. You walk in here, flaunting that hat, and think you can get away with it?" "I don't think I'm getting away with anything," Daniel shot back, his tone calm but firm. "I came here to shop. You're the one making a scene." "Enough!" Greg shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of his anger. He turned to the security guards, gesturing wildly. "Remove him. Now!" The guards hesitated again, their discomfort visible. One of them stepped forward tentatively, holding up a hand. "Sir, maybe we should slow down. He hasn't actually done anything." "Did I stutter?" Greg cut him off, his voice shrill with fury. "I said remove him." The guard faltered, glancing at Daniel apologetically. "I'm sorry, sir," he said quietly, his tone almost embarrassed. "We're going to have to ask you to leave." Daniel didn't move. "You don't need to do this," he said to the guard, his voice steady. "You know it's wrong." The guard hesitated, clearly torn. But Greg wasn't waiting anymore. "Do it!" he screamed, his face bright red. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the guards slowly stepped forward, their shoulders sagging as they prepared to carry out Greg's orders. A hush fell over the scene, broken only by the faint hum of the mall's air conditioning and the occasional shuffle of feet. Daniel's posture remained calm, his hands at his sides as he watched the guards approach. But there was something in his expression, a quiet confidence, a sense of certainty that hadn't been there before. And then he spoke. "Fine," Daniel said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "But you're about to regret this." Greg's laughter boomed across the room, cruel and mocking. "Oh, I doubt that," he sneered. "You're the one who's leaving, not me." Greg's laugh echoed through the halls, sharp and grating. It was the kind of laugh that demanded attention, a declaration that he believed himself untouchable. The crowd exchanged uneasy glances, their murmurs growing louder, but Greg didn't seem to notice. His attention was locked on Daniel like a predator zeroing in on prey. "You're about to regret this?" Greg mocked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Regret what? Asking a disrespectful troublemaker to leave my mall? Oh please, you don't scare me." Daniel tilted his head slightly, his expression still calm, but his eyes narrowed. "It's not about scaring you. It's about how you treat people." Greg sneered, taking a step closer, his broad frame towering over Daniel. "Don't lecture me, buddy. You walked in here looking for trouble, and now you're getting exactly what you asked for." The crowd bristled, whispers floating between spectators. "He's losing it," someone muttered. A teenage girl near the front leaned toward her friend. "What's his problem? It's just a hat." Greg snapped his head toward the girl, his face reddening further. "You got something to say?" he barked, startling her into silence. "Mind your business." The crowd recoiled slightly, murmurs now turning to audible disapproval. Even the security guards shifted uncomfortably, clearly regretting being part of Greg's meltdown. One of them, a lanky young man named Jason, cleared his throat and spoke up hesitantly. "Sir, maybe we should just—" "I said I'll handle it," Greg bellowed, cutting him off. His voice cracked, but the anger behind it was impossible to ignore. "If you can't do your job, then I'll find someone who can." Jason froze, clearly unwilling to push back further. The other guard shifted his weight nervously, his eyes darting between Greg and Daniel as though trying to decide which one posed the bigger problem. Daniel, meanwhile, remained unshaken. He kept his gaze on Greg, unblinking and calm, which only seemed to enrage the manager further. "I don't understand what you think you're accomplishing here," Daniel said finally, his tone measured. "What I'm accomplishing?" Greg shot back, his voice pitching higher. "I'm accomplishing exactly what I set out to do. Keeping this mall a decent place. People like you think you can just walk in here, flash your little political statements, and make everyone uncomfortable? Not on my watch." Daniel's brow furrowed slightly, but his tone stayed even. "So you decide what's decent and what's not? You think that's your job?" "Yes," Greg spat, pointing a thick finger at Daniel. "This is my mall. I keep it clean, respectable, and safe for everyone. You're a disturbance, and you're leaving." The crowd stirred again, their whispers louder now. A middle-aged man near the back crossed his arms and scoffed loudly. "Safe for everyone? He's just standing there. You're the only disturbance here." Greg's head snapped around, his glare landing on the man. "Oh, you think you're funny?" he barked. "Maybe you'd like to leave too." The man smirked and shook his head. "You can't kick everyone out who disagrees with you, pal. That's not how this works." Greg's hands curled into fists, his shoulders heaving with barely contained anger. He was unraveling, and the crowd knew it. Even those who had originally watched out of curiosity were now clearly turning against him. Greg's behavior was unhinged, irrational, and impossible to defend. "I don't care what any of you think," Greg shouted, his voice hoarse. "If you don't like it, you can leave too. This is my mall, and I make the rules." Jason, the younger security guard, stepped forward again, his voice shaking slightly as he spoke. "Sir, you're making a scene. Maybe we should just let this go." Greg whirled on him, his face inches from Jason's. "Did I ask for your opinion? Huh? I'm the manager here. You work for me, and if you can't follow orders, I'll make sure you don't work here at all." Jason shrank back, his face pale. "Sorry, sir." Greg turned back to Daniel, his breathing heavy, his face blotchy and red. "And you," he hissed, jabbing a finger at Daniel again. "You don't get to stand here like you own the place, like you can do whatever you want. Not while I'm in charge." Daniel's lips curled into the faintest of smiles, his posture completely relaxed. "You're sure about that?" he asked quietly, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Greg's face contorted with rage. "I don't need to be sure. I am sure. You're done here. I'm giving you 5 seconds to walk out, or I'll drag you out myself." "Do it," Daniel replied, his voice unwavering. The crowd gasped collectively. Phones were still trained on the scene, capturing every second of Greg's unraveling. The manager stood frozen for a moment, blinking as though he hadn't expected Daniel to call his bluff. But his pride wouldn't let him back down now. Greg lunged forward, grabbing Daniel's arm roughly. "Fine. If you won't leave on your own, I'll—" "Stop!" A voice boomed from the crowd, cutting through the tension like a gunshot. Everyone turned toward the sound. An older woman stepped forward, her expression hard and her voice shaking with anger. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, pointing at Greg. "You're the one causing a scene, not him." The crowd murmured in agreement, heads nodding, voices rising. "He's right," someone yelled. "Let him go." Greg froze, his grip on Daniel's arm loosening slightly. He looked around, suddenly aware of just how many people were watching him. The realization made his face darken further, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. "This is none of your business." Greg barked at the woman. "You people don't understand. He's here to cause trouble, and I'm stopping it. I don't care what any of you think." Daniel pulled his arm free, stepping back slightly but still facing Greg head-on. His calm composure made Greg look even more irrational in comparison. "You don't care what they think?" Daniel repeated, his voice low but clear. "You don't care that you're embarrassing yourself? That you're alienating everyone here?" Greg's chest heaved as he glared at Daniel, his voice breaking with frustration. "I don't care about any of that. This is my mall, and I'm in charge." Daniel's expression shifted slightly, just a flicker of something unreadable, like the calm before a storm. Around them, the crowd grew restless, their frustration with Greg reaching a boiling point. Phones were still recording, every second of his meltdown immortalized. Greg opened his mouth to yell again, but his voice was drowned out by a sharp sound. Applause. One by one, people in the crowd started clapping, their faces lit with sarcastic smiles. "Great job, man," someone called. "You really showed him." The clapping grew louder, mocking, until it filled the entire space. Greg's face turned a deep shade of crimson, his expression shifting from rage to confusion. He spun in a circle, his gaze darting around wildly as if searching for an ally. But there were none. Daniel stood silent, watching him with an unreadable look. Greg's meltdown was almost complete, but the crowd could sense that something bigger was coming. The applause grew louder, rolling through the mall like a slow, sarcastic wave. Greg's face contorted as he spun toward the crowd, his chest heaving, his teeth grinding audibly. The clapping wasn't praise, it was ridicule. Each sharp smack of hands echoing off the pristine tile floors felt like a jab straight to his ego. "Enough!" Greg roared, his voice cracking as he pointed furiously at the crowd. "All of you, shut up. This isn't funny." But the clapping didn't stop. It only grew louder, fueled by Greg's unraveling. Phones were still pointed at him, their screens aglow, capturing every second of his public breakdown. Daniel, meanwhile, stood still and calm, his hands loosely at his sides as he watched Greg spiral further. "Look at him," a voice called from the back of the crowd, dripping with amusement. Acting like a toddler, Greg whipped around, his face a splotchy crimson. "Who said that?" he bellowed, his voice almost hysterical. "Who said it?" No one answered, but the murmurs and scattered laughter continued. A middle-aged man near the front shook his head, folding his arms across his chest. "You're embarrassing yourself, pal. Just let it go. Let it go." Greg snapped, rounding on him. "You think I'm going to let this go?" He swung his arm dramatically toward Daniel, who still hadn't moved. "This guy comes into my mall, stirring up trouble, and you people act like I'm the bad guy." "Yes," someone shouted. Greg's jaw dropped slightly, his fury momentarily faltering under the sheer bluntness of the response. "You don't get it," he yelled, regaining his composure, or what was left of it. "You don't understand how this works. I run this mall. I make the rules. And if I say he's out, he's out." Daniel finally spoke, his voice low but steady, cutting through the chaos like a knife. "The only one making trouble here is you, Greg." Greg turned on him like a cornered animal, his entire body trembling with anger. "You don't get to talk to me like that. You're done here. Security." He spun toward the guards again, his voice shrill with desperation. "Why are you still standing there? I said get him out." Jason, the younger guard, shifted nervously. His partner looked equally unsure, glancing between Greg and Daniel. "Sir," Jason said cautiously, I don't pay you to think." Greg shouted, cutting him off. His voice cracked painfully at the end. sending another ripple of laughter through the crowd. Greg's face burned a furious red, his eyes wild. "You work for me. If you can't follow orders, I'll find someone who can." Jason's face fell, his shoulders slumping as he glanced at the floor. Greg turned back to Daniel, his entire body coiled tight, like a spring ready to snap. "You think you're so clever? Standing there smirking like you're untouchable?" "I'm not smirking," Daniel replied calmly. "I'm just wondering how much further you're going to take this." Greg jabbed a finger at him, his hands trembling. "Don't push me. You don't know who you're dealing with." The crowd exchanged glances, the unease palpable now. It was clear that Greg was spiraling completely out of control. He looked unhinged, his voice no longer commanding but manic, his words tumbling out in an incoherent mix of anger and pride. "You think this is funny?" Greg shouted, his voice ragged. "All of you think this is some kind of joke?" A young mother in the crowd shook her head, holding her child close. "You're scaring people," she said loudly, her voice firm but calm. Greg's head snapped toward her, his expression feral. "I'm not scaring anyone," he shouted. "He's the one causing problems." The woman didn't back down. "No, he's not. You are. You're screaming at a man for wearing a hat. That hat represents everything wrong with this country," Greg yelled, his voice pitching higher as his justification spilled out, unfiltered and irrational. "People like him come in here, thinking they can rub it in our faces. I won't stand for it." Daniel sighed softly, his calm demeanor unchanged. "You're making this worse for yourself, Greg." "Worse?" Greg laughed bitterly, though the sound bordered on hysterical. "What are you gonna do? Huh? Call corporate? File a complaint? Good luck with that. I run this place. I make the rules. And if you think anyone's going to take your side, you're delusional." The crowd bristled at Greg's words, audible groans of disapproval growing louder. Someone near the back muttered, "What a joke." Greg ignored them. His focus remained locked on Daniel, his rage bubbling over like a pot left boiling too long. "I don't care who you are or what you think you're entitled to. You're not welcome here, and I'll make sure you don't come back." Daniel remained quiet for a moment, studying Greg with an almost unnerving patience. Around them, the crowd seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Even the security guards were frozen, too unsure, or perhaps too intimidated to act. Finally, Daniel spoke again, his voice even but carrying an unmistakable weight. "Greg, you don't know what you're saying. You don't know what you're doing." Greg laughed harshly, throwing his arms out wide. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm putting an end to this nonsense. Right here, right now. And if you're wrong?" Daniel asked simply. Greg's face contorted, a bitter sneer pulling at his lips. "I'm not wrong. I'm never wrong." The words hung in the air for a beat too long, the silence that followed almost suffocating. The crowd's eyes darted between Greg and Daniel, tension so thick it felt as though the very walls of the mall were closing in. Daniel's gaze remained fixed on Greg, unflinching and steady. "You'll find out soon enough," he said quietly. Greg froze at the words, his expression faltering for the first time. For the briefest of moments, something like doubt flickered in his eyes. But then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by an even deeper anger. "I don't need to find out anything," Greg snapped, though his voice was less sure now. "You're leaving and that's final. Security, take him out." The guards hesitated, exchanging glances before reluctantly stepping forward again. Jason cleared his throat, his voice trembling slightly. "Sir, maybe we should." "I don't pay you to think." Greg exploded again, his voice shattering the moment of calm. The crowd gasped, their murmurs turning to audible outrage. People exchanged disgusted looks, shaking their heads and muttering about Greg's behavior. Someone in the back shouted, "You're out of line, man." Greg spun on his heel, his eyes scanning the crowd like a storm ready to burst. "You people don't run this mall. I do. And if you don't like it, you can all leave." The words lingered in the air like a bad taste, his outburst reverberating off the mall's pristine surfaces. Around him, The crowd grew restless, their frustration boiling over. Greg's downfall was coming. Everyone could feel it. Everyone except Greg himself. Greg stood in the middle of the mall like a volcano ready to erupt, his chest heaving and his face flushed red. The crowd watched him now, not with curiosity but with open disdain. People muttered loudly, shaking their heads, their expressions twisted with disbelief and disgust. "You're embarrassing yourself," a voice called from somewhere near the back. "Get off your power trip," another chimed in, sharper this time. Greg ignored them or pretended to. His hands shook at his sides, clenched into trembling fists as he pointed once again at Daniel, who still hadn't moved. "You think this is funny?" Greg spat, his voice teetering on the edge of hysteria. "You're all enjoying this, aren't you? Watching me deal with some troublemaker who doesn't know his place." "You're the troublemaker, dude," a man near the front called out, his arms crossed over his chest. Greg whirled on him, his eyes wild. "Shut up," he barked, his voice cracking. "You don't know what you're talking about. I run this place. I make the rules." The man scoffed, shaking his head. "You're the only one who seems to care about that hat. You're not a hero. You're a bully." The crowd buzzed with agreement, the tension swelling, pressing down on Greg as if the air itself had turned against him. Greg spun back to face Daniel, his composure in shreds. "I don't care what these people think," he hissed, jabbing a trembling finger in Daniel's face. "You're leaving now." Daniel met Greg's gaze steadily, unshaken. "No, Greg," he said calmly. "I'm not." Greg's jaw clenched so hard it looked like it might snap. "You don't get to say no. You don't have a choice. This is my mall." A snort of laughter broke from the crowd, and Greg's eyes darted toward it, his focus splintering. "Who said that?" he demanded, his voice shrill. "Show yourself." "Does it matter?" Someone fired back. "You're a joke. Everyone here sees it." Greg's face contorted, his fury now beyond words. He looked at Jason, the younger guard, and his partner. "You useless idiots. Remove him. Now." Jason hesitated, his face pale. "Sir, I don't think this is right." "Right?" Greg shrieked, his voice breaking. "What's right is you doing what I tell you to do." He stormed up to Jason, standing so close their noses nearly touched. "If you won't do your job, I'll make sure you don't have a job. Got it?" Jason swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. The older guard, clearly just as uneasy, stepped in. "Sir, maybe we should—" "Shut up," Greg roared, spinning on his heel. "You're all useless. Every single one of you." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and murmurs turned into outright shouts. "This guy's unhinged," a woman shouted. "Where's corporate when you need them?" Another voice rang out. "Can someone fire this guy already?" Greg's breathing turned erratic, his entire body trembling as he spun wildly to address the crowd. "You people don't run this place. You don't matter. You think you can judge me? You're pathetic." The words landed like a slap. The crowd was no longer just frustrated, they were furious. Phones were trained on Greg like an army of witnesses, and even the security guards were backing away from him now, clearly unwilling to be part of the mess. Greg turned back to Daniel, his voice dropping into a venomous snarl. "This is your fault. You did this. Walking in here, making trouble, turning everyone against me. You'll regret it. I'll make sure of it." Daniel's eyes darkened slightly, though his calm never wavered. "I haven't done anything to you, Greg," he said evenly. "You did this to yourself." Greg's lip curled. "Don't you lecture me, you arrogant—" "Enough!" A man's voice cut through Greg's tirade, sharp and commanding. The crowd fell silent. The sound was so sudden, so precise, it felt as though the entire mall had stopped breathing. Greg froze mid-rant, his wide eyes scanning for the source of the interruption. From the back of the crowd, a well-dressed man stepped forward, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He was tall, wearing a pressed suit that seemed to absorb the chaos around him. The crowd parted for him like water, their whispers growing louder as they realized who he was. Greg stared, his face pale now, the fury draining from him as the man came closer. His voice cracked as he stammered, "Wait, what are you?" The man said nothing as he reached Daniel's side, standing calmly next to him. He looked at Greg, his expression unreadable, and the tension in the air grew so thick it was almost suffocating. Greg's mouth opened and closed, the color draining completely from his face as realization dawned. What are you doing here?" he stammered. Daniel crossed his arms, turning to face Greg fully. His voice was quiet, but every word rang out like a bell. "You're about to find out." Greg stumbled back a step, his wide eyes darting between Daniel and the suited man. The once cocky manager looked small now, like a balloon pricked with a needle, his bluster leaking away as quickly as it had appeared. The crowd buzzed with curiosity, the energy electric. Phones zoomed in, whispers filled the air, and all eyes were glued to the scene unfolding. Greg blinked rapidly, his voice faltering. What does that mean?" I don't understand." Daniel raised an eyebrow, his calm expression unwavering. "You don't understand?" he repeated quietly. "Then maybe it's time you learn something, Greg." Greg's mouth opened to protest, but no words came out. For the first time all afternoon, he seemed completely at a loss, his bravado crumbling under the weight of something he couldn't quite grasp. The suited man turned to face Greg fully, his posture rigid, his gaze unflinching. The silence was deafening, a powder keg ready to explode. Everyone in the mall watched, breath held, knowing that whatever came next would change everything. Greg's face twitched as he shifted his weight nervously, the smugness finally stripped away. The man in the suit, standing beside Daniel, didn't say a word at first. He simply stared at Greg with an expression so unreadable it bordered on cold. The crowd sensed the shift immediately. The energy crackled, the silence deafening as everyone waited. The suited man finally took a step forward, his shoes clicking against the pristine tile floor, each sound like a countdown to Greg's undoing. Who are you?" Greg stammered, his voice cracking as he tried to recover even a shred of control. You're not supposed to be here. This has nothing to do with you." The man ignored him completely, turning instead to Jason, the young security guard who still stood frozen nearby. "What's your name, son?" he asked, his voice deep, steady, and laced with authority. Jason blinked, clearly caught off guard. Jason, sir." The man nodded. "Jason, is this how you're trained to handle conflict here?" Jason looked at Greg, then back at the man. He swallowed hard. "And no, sir. I don't think so. Did you ask him to harass this gentleman?" The man gestured toward Daniel, whose calm had remained unshaken throughout the ordeal. Jason's face flushed. "No, sir. That was the manager's." "Stop it," Greg hissed, cutting him off. But the damage was already done. Jason glanced at Greg, his face a mix of fear and relief now that someone in actual authority was taking over. The man in the suit turned back to Greg, his gaze locking onto him like a spotlight. "You like to throw your weight around, don't you?" Greg sputtered. "Excuse me? Who do you think you are coming in here and—" "I don't think," the man interrupted coolly, his words slicing through Greg's frantic bluster like a blade. "I know who I am, and so should you, considering I sign your paycheck." Greg froze completely. The words hit him like a wrecking ball. His mouth opened, then closed, his expression shifting from confusion to horror as the realization crashed over him. "You what?" Greg stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't blink. "I'm the owner of this mall." The words hung in the air like a bomb dropped into the middle of the crowd. Gasps rippled outward, and the murmur of voices swelled instantly. Phones zoomed in on Greg's face, capturing every second of his humiliation as his entire body seemed to deflate. "The owner," the man in the suit continued, his voice calm and steady, each word deliberate. "My name is Robert Harris. I own this mall. And that man you've been screaming at for the last half hour," he pointed toward Daniel. "He's my partner." Greg's face drained of all color. Sweat dotted his forehead, his hands trembling as he looked helplessly at Daniel, then back at Robert. I I didn't know, he croaked. That much is obvious, Robert replied sharply, not missing a beat. You were so busy screaming, threatening, and embarrassing yourself that you didn't stop to think about your job, about your customers, about common decency. The crowd erupted into murmurs again, people exchanging looks of vindication and glee as they watched Greg squirm. Phones captured every angle of his downfall, every drop of sweat, every flicker of panic on his face. I was just trying to enforce the rules, Greg blurted, his voice desperate now. I didn't mean rules, Robert cut in sharply. What rules, Greg? I heard you loud and clear. You said you make the rules. The words hit like a sledgehammer. Greg flinched visibly, his gaze darting everywhere except at Robert. I didn't mean it like that. Didn't mean it like that? Robert repeated coldly. You screamed at my staff. You screamed at our customers. You put your hands on my business partner. You've embarrassed yourself and this establishment beyond repair. All because of a hat. Greg's mouth flapped uselessly, no words coming out this time. His face had gone from red to ghostly pale, his confidence shattered like glass on the tile floor. Robert turned slightly to address the crowd, his posture unwavering and commanding. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for what you've witnessed today. This is not how we run business at this mall. You all deserve to feel respected here, regardless of your background, your beliefs, or what you're wearing. What happened today is unacceptable. The crowd murmured their approval, some clapping softly as they nodded in agreement. Greg, meanwhile, took a stumbling step backward, as though he might bolt. I can fix this, he said hoarsely, his voice breaking. I didn't. You're done here, Robert said flatly, cutting him off with a finality that made the entire room still. As of this moment, you're no longer the manager of this mall. Greg froze, his eyes wide, his chest rising and falling in rapid bursts. No, wait, please. I didn't mean. Robert ignored him, turning to Jason and the other security guard. Escort him out. Make sure he leaves the premises. Jason blinked, momentarily stunned before realization set in. For the first time all day, his shoulders straightened as he looked at Greg with something close to pity. You heard him, Jason said, his voice firm. Greg stumbled backward another step, shaking his head. Wait, no, this is a mistake. You can't. Jason grabbed Greg by the arm, the other guard moving to his other side. Let's go, Jason said evenly, his tone leaving no room for argument. The crowd watched, their phones still recording, as Greg was led toward the exit, his protests growing weaker and more pitiful with each step. Please, just give me another chance. I didn't know. Robert shook his head as he watched Greg disappear, his face unreadable. Daniel, standing beside him, let out a soft sigh, though his expression remained calm. Some people don't learn until it's too late, Daniel said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Robert nodded slowly, turning back to the crowd. Thank you for your patience, everyone. This situation is over. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of your time here. The crowd erupted into applause, the energy in the room finally shifting. Relief, satisfaction, and vindication hung in the air, the tension that had held the mall hostage now gone. As the applause rang out, Daniel turned to Robert and shook his hand firmly. That was handled well. Robert offered a faint smile. Sometimes people dig their own graves. All you have to do is let them. Greg's shouts echoed weakly as Jason and the other security guard dragged him toward the exit. His voice was cracked and desperate, barely audible over the chatter of the crowd that had gathered to witness his undoing. Phones remained raised, their cameras trained on him like hawks circling prey. Wait, you don't understand. Greg howled, trying to twist out of Jason's grip. This is a misunderstanding. I can fix this. But no one was listening anymore. The crowd had moved from outrage to outright ridicule, some shaking their heads, others laughing in disbelief. I make the rules, a teenager mocked loudly, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he quoted Greg's earlier outburst. How's that working out for you now, boss? A ripple of laughter followed, cutting through Greg like a blade. He glared toward the voice, his face twisted with helpless rage. "You think this is funny?" he spat, though it carried none of the authority it had before. "Oh, it's hilarious," a woman shot back, crossing her arms. "A grown man losing his mind over a hat? You embarrassed yourself, buddy. Nobody else." Jason's grip on Greg tightened as they approached the automatic doors. The glass panels whooshed open, letting in a cold gust of air that seemed to drain what little fight Greg had left. He glanced over his shoulder one last time, his eyes locking on Robert Harris and Daniel. "Please," Greg croaked, his voice breaking as he stumbled, his feet dragging against the tile. "Mr. Harris, I didn't know. I didn't know." Robert stood tall, unmoving, his face impassive as he looked down at Greg. "You didn't care to know," he replied evenly. "That's the problem." The doors closed behind Greg with a dull hiss, and for a brief moment, the entire mall seemed to exhale, the tension finally breaking. The crowd buzzed with whispers and murmurs, people exchanging gleeful commentary as they lowered their phones and started dispersing. "I can't believe he said half that stuff," someone muttered, shaking their head. "Serves him right," another added. "I hope he goes viral. Maybe then he'll learn." Robert turned back toward Jason and the other guard, who were walking back inside now, clearly shaken but relieved to be rid of Greg. "You two did the right thing at the end," Robert said, his tone measured. "Thank you for stepping up." Jason blinked, his face turning red. "I'm sorry, sir," he stammered. "We should have acted sooner." Robert shook his head. "The important thing is you did the right thing when it counted. Let this be a lesson. Your judgment matters more than blind obedience." Jason nodded, his posture straighter now. The other guard exhaled softly, muttering a quiet, "Thank you, sir," before they both retreated to resume their posts. The crowd had mostly dispersed by now, though a few lingered nearby, still whispering to each other as they eyed Robert and Daniel with newfound respect. Some offered nods of approval, others muttered, "Good job," as they passed by. Daniel turned to Robert, arching an eyebrow as he scanned the quieting mall. "Think he's learned his lesson?" Robert let out a faint, humorless laugh. "Greg? Not a chance. But everyone else here? I think they got the message." Daniel nodded, the calm confidence never leaving his face. "Actions speak louder than words, after all." "Exactly," Robert replied. "People like Greg dig their own graves. You don't need to do anything but stand back and let it happen." Outside the mall, Greg sat slumped on a bench near the parking lot, his shoulders hunched and his face buried in his hands. He didn't even notice as passers-by stared at him, their faces a mix of pity and judgment. Some recognized him, whispering as they walked past, their phones still in hand. "Isn't that the manager?" "Yep, the one who went off on that guy for wearing a hat. He got fired immediately, didn't he? Good. He deserved it." Greg groaned softly, the words ringing in his ears like a chorus of condemnation. He reached for his phone, his hands trembling as he opened social media. What he saw made his stomach drop. Videos of the confrontation were already flooding his feed. Clips of him screaming, pointing, throwing his tantrum. The captions were merciless. "Mall manager loses his mind over a hat. When ego meets consequences, power trip ends in humiliation." The comment sections were even worse. Thousands of people had already weighed in, their words cutting deeper than Greg cared to admit. "This guy's unhinged. Imagine thinking you're king of a mall. Hope he enjoys unemployment." Greg's face burned as he scrolled, each comment twisting the knife further. He tried to tell himself it wasn't that bad, that it would blow over, but deep down he knew better. He'd humiliated himself in front of dozens of people, and now the entire internet was laughing at him. Back inside the mall, Robert and Daniel stood near the main entrance, watching as the last of the crowd dispersed. Daniel adjusted his hat slightly, the red, white, and blue stitching catching the light as he smiled faintly. "Think we'll be seeing him again?" Daniel asked. Robert shook his head, his expression firm. "If he has any sense left, he'll stay far away." Daniel chuckled softly. "Let's hope so." The two men stood there for a moment longer, surveying the mall that Greg had once tried to claim as his kingdom. The air felt different now, lighter, calmer, as though the toxic energy Greg had brought with him had finally been swept away. Around them, business resumed as usual. Shoppers browsed stores, families laughed together, and the hum of the mall returned to normal. The only trace of Greg's meltdown lay in the lingering whispers and the occasional chuckle from someone recounting the events to a friend. Robert clapped Daniel on the shoulder. "Come on, let's get a coffee. I think we've earned it." Daniel nodded, his faint smile widening as the two men turned and walked toward the food court. Behind them, the mall pulsed with life once more, a testament to the fact that no one, no matter how loud, irrational, or egotistical, was bigger than the people around them. Greg's reign of petty tyranny had ended, and the mall, it was better for it.